Hello, and welcome back to the lecture series. My name is Professor John Eicher, and the title of today's lecture is 19th-Century Imperialism. The sun never sets on the British Empire because the lights are always on at the Foreign Office. And here I'm referencing the British Foreign Office because Britain was the greatest imperial power during the 19th century and had the most extensive bureaucracy managing that empire. So to begin with, what was imperialism? Well, it was a system of global, political, economic, military, and colonial expansion and control adopted by European powers during the 1800s. It relied on new technologies developed by Westerners during the 1800s. Remember the industrial revolutions we talked about last lecture? Well, Europeans were very excited to take those inventions and use them to exploit other people abroad. And imperialism also made Western states and corporations aggressively compete for overseas markets and national dominance, what was called empire for empire's sake. So even as those Western nation states were trying to forcefully incorporate the peasants into their national communities, they were also projecting that power out and trying to imperialize people all over the world. It really was nationalism on steroids. But wait a minute. What was colonialism? These terms are often confused, and even during today's lecture, I might mistakenly say colonialism when I mean imperialism. And sometimes imperialism actually involved aspects of colonialism, so let me explain what colonialism is. Colonialism lasted from about the time that the Spanish and the Portuguese invaded the Americas to the era of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The emphasis was on settling coastal regions. The point was to build trade routes between colonies and metropoles, these centers of power in Europe. And the method of doing this was to kill, enslave, or remove native populations and then replace them with settlers and imported slaves. The goal was to obtain precious metals like silver and gold, and materials for immediate use, like sugarcane or fur pelts or lumber. And the religious aspect of this was Catholic, and there are a very limited amount of players here, basically countries that already had maritime power, like Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and the Netherlands. Here we see a depiction of the conquest of the Incas by Pizarro, and a painting of New Amsterdam, which was later renamed New York. This is a map of colonialism. As you can see, most of the conquered territories are in coastal regions. Now there's a bit of an interlude during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, European countries refocused their attention to their own backyard and ended their adventures abroad for a while. After that was over, though, you have the explosion of imperialism, which lasts from about 1840 up until the end of the Second World War. And here the emphasis is on invading and conquering interior regions, defining and developing strategic spheres of influence for each European power. And now the point is to settle and administer native populations rather than kill them or remove them. The goal is to import numerous raw inputs for manufacturing. So instead of just those raw materials for immediate use, now you're interested in things like rubber, which can be developed into lots of different products, tin, lead, cadmium, all kinds of things that you will then use in manufacturing. And once you manufacture those products, you can then resell them to those colonies of yours at much higher prices. Religiously, we have Catholics and Protestants, but we also have humanitarian missionaries who export this concept of progress. And we have several more players added to the list now. Britain, France, of course, but also the United States, Russia, Germany, Italy, and Belgium. And here is a depiction of what imperialism looked like in practice, basically robbing a lot of the wealth from undeveloped countries and exporting it north. Now, China is kind of a unique case we'll talk about in a little bit. It wasn't officially invaded and imperialized, but it was controlled by European powers nonetheless. And here is a picture of a congregational missionary in Hawaii, what would become part of the American Empire. Now, of course, these definitions are not definite. American and Russian imperialism looked a lot like colonialism, moving across the land rather than the water. This idea that America should extend from sea to shining sea, and the same thing went for Russia. The arguments in this lecture revolve around imperialism being caused by a certain set of factors and then aided by a certain set of factors. So first of all, it was caused by the myth of progress, this idea that Western civilization is better than other civilizations and Westerners should spread it. Bureaucracies, both government and corporate, they broke up and simplified morally and materially complex decision-making processes through globalization and specialization. More on that as we move through the lecture. Abstraction, which aided bureaucratic power by reducing complex real-world problems into charts and statistics. And control. The entire point of imperialism was to expand European state control beyond national borders. Imperialism was aided by science, which asked very troubling questions during this time, like what race is superior, and technology, which made imperialism cheap and easy. Nationalism, which led European governments and businesses to compete for overseas territories to make their nations great. And racism, which led government and business agents in imperial territories to believe they were superior to those they governed. And this was an especially important factor on the ground, where policies were enforced. And so, in addition to our usual A, B, C taglines at the bottom, we're going to add a few more here: progress, science, technology, nationalism, and racism. So I want to pause for a moment and go over this concept of abstraction again. I know I mention it in every lecture and set it up in that first lecture, but I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves of what this means. So abstractions privilege predictions over experiences and concepts over reality. Here we see a picture of a child taking a standardized test. This is privileging the concepts that the child is supposed to learn versus the reality that maybe that child is very good at lots of things, but just not taking tests. I also draw your attention here to privileging predictions over experiences with these top two pictures. On the left, we see this prediction that nuclear power is going to be great for the future, and then we see the reality, which looks a little different, and this is a picture of Chernobyl, Ukraine. Abstractions turn people into numbers via statistics, sociology, economics, epidemiology, political science, etc. So here you see a person literally dying from wounds in Iraq. On the right, much sanitized version of that death is depicted here through statistics. On the bottom, we see a woman doing her taxes. On the right, we see the abstraction of taxes being done. Abstractions make sweeping political, social, and economic decisions based on those statistics, from policing to public health to the stock market. On the top, we see a depiction of the stock market doing poorly via the Dow Jones Industrial. On the right, we see the reality of unemployment as the result of the stock market doing poorly. On the bottom, we see projections and predictions for flattening the curve when it came to COVID. On the right, we see the reality of that: empty streets, empty schools, people locked up in their homes. Abstractions make diverse groups of people conform to rational planning and decision-making, from gridded roads to safety codes. On the top right there, you see a picture of a Medina in Morocco. This is a very confusing landscape for anyone trying to administer that area. You don't know how to occupy or invade the place. You don't know where to turn the water off or the electricity. It seems very cut up and very confusing and disorienting to an outsider. On the left is an aerial photo of Chicago. This place is very easy to control. It would be very easy to invade and occupy. There's a centralized place where all of the utilities can be found, and you can easily blockade these streets to totally shut the place down and control it. On the bottom, you see the universal guidelines for staying safe with COVID, and everyone should conform to those guidelines. On the right, you see the reality: people touching their masks, not wearing masks, not following those directions really at all. In sum, abstractions allow for the social engineering of populations by government and business. This was especially destructive for caricatured and homogenized foreign natives, who were easily amenable to being abstract entities that people in London or Paris didn't really have to think about. So remember when we discussed bureaucracies and contracts during the Renaissance? Well, during the 1800s, they grew up, fully replacing the authority of the written word over the spoken word. And the widespread use of written contracts, as we will see in a moment, meant the triumph and authority of abstraction over reality, which meant trouble for colonized individuals. So first, I want to meditate a bit on what was lost. Imperialism, like nationalism, eradicates unique cultures, histories, and skill sets. And it also made Westerners forget equal encounters with those they now felt superior to. And an example here comes from the Benin Empire, which was located in what is now present-day Nigeria. And in the 1500s, they existed on equal economic terms with Portugal and Spain. And we see a depiction here on the top left. We see individuals who came from Africa intermixing with native Portuguese. Of course, we have both white and black slaves, water carriers in the background. But in the front here, we see a black boatman who would not have been a slave. And there in the middle right of the painting, we actually see a black knight of the Order of Santiago. On the right, we see an ivory mask which represents the Oba, or king's wife, and it demonstrates the kingdom's sophistication and power. Note the Portuguese traders in her crown, which represent how they are dependent on Benin's greatness for their own wealth. Now, fast forwarding a couple hundred years to 1897, the British invaded the Benin Empire. They looted the king's palace and returned to London with the treasure, including that mask we saw earlier. When these artifacts were shown publicly, they really confused the reigning racist theories about development of human civilization and the assumption that the West was the best. Obviously, these and many other artifacts from around the world proved that non-Western cultures were quite sophisticated, and oftentimes more sophisticated than Europeans. Finally, here's a statement by Chief Kabongo of Kenya's Kikuyu people, and he was born in the 1870s and recalled this about how things had changed. He said, "Something has taken away the meaning of our lives. Above all, it has taken from us the ways of living in which our lives from birth to death were dedicated to Nagai. Now we have many laws and many clothes. Men seem to care more for disputes about ideas than for the fullness of life, where all work and live for all. The young men are learning new ways. The children make marks which they call writing, but they forget their own language and customs. They know not the laws of their people, and they do not pray to Nagai. They ride fast in motor cars, they work fire sticks that kill, they make music from a box, but they have no land and no food, and they have lost laughter." Now, this is an old man, and old men are sometimes susceptible to sentimentality, but I think there's a lot of truth in what he's saying here, and particularly as it relates to what we're talking about with abstractions, right? They have disputes about ideas, not realities, and they have no land that had been taken from them through contracts, but they do have a lot of consumer products imported from the West. So as we move through this lecture, I'm going to talk about causes and consequences, and our first cause is politics and nationalism. So there are lots of different political reasons why Europeans engaged in imperialism. For the French, they used it as a distraction from domestic political turbulence at home and problems they were also having nationalizing their own people, and also, of course, to compete with Great Britain. Germany conflated imperialism with nationhood. If you recall, Germany didn't become a nation state until 1871. So as they became a nation, they also realized they should also have an empire. Over in Belgium, Leopold II wanted an empire like his first cousin, Queen Victoria of England. The weird thing about Leopold II is he went overseas to try and gather money for his imperial escapades, like in the United States. And when he did that, he said he wanted an empire because he was anti-slavery. He didn't want to drag people out of Africa and exploit them. He wanted to exploit them in their own homes. Russia and the United States used concepts of manifest destiny to expand both east and west. In Japan, the only non-European country to have a major empire during this period, embraced imperialism as a path to Western-style modernization. Second cause here, geopolitics and militarism. Imperial expansion safeguarded existing colonies and trade routes at the expense of other powers. So an example here is the Suez Canal. The British and the French went in together to build this canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and now they realize it's a huge asset that needs to be protected, which led them to encroach further and further on the dying Ottoman Empire that surrounded it. Imperial territories were also used as bargaining chips for European power politics. So an example here, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, way more concerned with issues in Europe, but if he had imperial territories, he could use them as bargaining chips. And here, this is a very famous depiction of these men sitting around a conference table in Berlin with a huge map of Africa. That meeting, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, that's how Africa got a lot of its national lines to this day. European militaries valued the lives of imperial subjects less than Europeans, and this allowed for no-rules warfare. An example here comes from German Southwest Africa. They applied no-rules warfare to the Herero and Nama, which resulted in genocide. Upwards of 100,000 Hereros, Nama, and San died. The first phase was characterized by starvation and dehydration due to the prevention of these populations from leaving the desert. Once they were defeated, they were imprisoned in concentration camps, of course with barbed wire, that Industrial Revolution invention, where the majority died of disease, abuse, and exhaustion. European citizens and leaders were largely blind to these imperial horrors because they were racist and removed from them. And here we see a depiction of British John Bull and Uncle Sam dragging these populations to civilization. Another cause was, of course, the Industrial Revolutions. Until the 1800s, only wealthy European states with maritime technology could expand overseas. And here we see a depiction of the triangle trade that took manufactured goods from Europe to empires along the African coast, where they traded for slaves that had been gathered by those African empires from the interior of Africa. Those slaves were taken to the Americas, where they were exchanged for raw materials, and then back to Europe. Imperialism arose with the first Industrial Revolution and then exploded with the second Industrial Revolution. And we see this expansion of trade networks on this map here. The reason is you need a lot more inputs for the advanced manufactured goods that Europeans are making in the latter part of the 1800s. So we don't just use tin, as an example, for making cans. We also use it in toothpaste and home appliances, and the list goes on. An invention stemming from both industrial revolutions gave less populous and powerful European states the ability to expand overseas. And an example here is tiny little Belgium, which is able to conquer and then enslave huge swaths of the African continent. Steamships, railroads, concrete, telegraph machines, Gatling gun, barbed wire, TNT, quinine to prevent malaria, all of these things aided the Europeans in their expansion into those interior regions. Another cause, economics and bureaucracy. Global markets create global networks of money and resources. And here we see a depiction of the stock exchange in South Africa. Imperial trade networks protected scarce resources and excluded competition. This was called protectionism. The goal was to produce and consume everything within your own imperial network so you didn't have to trade with other empires. And this also assured necessities when geopolitical conflict broke out. So here an example comes from the Union blockade of the Confederacy during the American Civil War. The British really relied on the Confederacy for one of their biggest industries, which is textiles. But with no cotton shipments, they couldn't make those textiles. So that led Britain to shore up its power in Egypt and India, where it could grow that particular resource. Also, governments worked with businesses to manage their growing intercontinental empires. So the East India Company, Hudson's Bay, Standard Oil, all of these worked hand in glove with Western governments. So we might like to talk about the deep state, sure, but also deep corporate. And this is the era when both of these things really develop. And here's an org chart from the Erie Railroad. Each one of those little dots represents an individual as a part of that vast corporation. Here's a close-up. All of this was secured and supported with bureaucracies and contracts, which privileged and enforced abstractions over realities. And this, if you want to pause the lecture, is an exact reproduction of a standard treaty of the Royal Niger Company. Basically, this company would go up rivers in Africa and present this contract to communities all along the way to bring those territories into their empire. So, just pausing on some of this language here, these local individuals were meant to cede to the Royal Niger Company forever the whole of their territory. That company has full power to settle all native disputes arising from any cause whatsoever and pledge to never enter into any war without the sanction of the Royal Niger Company. It also gave that company power to mine, farm, and build in any portion of the country, and to bar outsiders from communicating with those populations. In return, that company binds itself not to interfere with any of the native laws or customs, but only consistently with the maintenance of order and good government, which of course would be defined by the company. And they also agreed to pay a, quote, reasonable amount, whatever that may be. If we can put ourselves in the place of those individuals, a boat with strange-looking people comes up, gives you a piece of paper. You've never really had much experience with paper. You affix your X to it, and they go on their way, and you think, okay, that was very strange. And then, a few months later, a gunboat shows up, and suddenly you're being forced to work and you have no freedoms. Another cause, individual adventure, religion, and eugenics. So there are some individual motives to expand empire, the romance of travel. Here an example comes from the American explorer Henry Stanley, who was commissioned by the New York Herald to go find an individual named David Livingstone, who was a missionary and doctor. So he treks all through Africa, and when he finds him, he says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," right? Because he's the only other white guy for thousands of miles. Obviously, religious motives, spreading Christianity. And I want to note here that there was sometimes a love-hate relationship between governments and religious organizations. Because on one hand, religious organizations were dependent on governments to allow them to spread the gospel in their empires. But also, missionaries that actually thought about the Bible and its message would get very upset at the very inhumane conditions that those governments created. And also scientific motives. The point here was to study inferior peoples, thanks Darwin, and the example comes from Dr. C. Ernest Cattle, a Denver theologian who wanted to travel to darkest Africa, in quotes, to find the real missing link between humanity and the lower animals and, ominously, bring back living specimens. So now let's examine the consequences. One consequence of imperialism was control. And here a relevant quote is, "To name is to possess." And Europeans did a lot of naming during the 1800s. And an example of control comes from the Spanish and then American Philippines. So Spain invaded the Philippines in the 1500s, and they encountered a population that was organized around small communities and was often very nomadic. By the 1800s, the Spanish wished to modernize these people and the land through bureaucratic efficiency. Thus, in 1849, Filipinos were instructed to take on permanent Hispanic last names. Until that point, they didn't have last names. The problem of not having last names had nothing to do with the people or improving their lives. The problem began and ended with the administrator and the tax collector. For a state builder, whether European or eventually native, the only goal was more control. And so each local Spanish official was given a catalog of names, in quotes here, taking care of that the distribution be made by letters of the alphabet. Towns were then actually given pages from that alphabetized catalog, producing whole areas with last names beginning with the same exact letter. Sometimes they even carved up whole islands like a pie and assigned names to each piece. The U.S. then enters this situation. After the Spanish-American War, they take over the Philippines and then leave power to local elites in 1946. Obviously, when Europeans left and new native leaders assumed power, they used the facade of restoring native control, even as they maintained and exploited the tools of modern bureaucratic control. And this happens all across the developing world, from Nigeria to Cambodia. After all, modern native leaders are just as interested in power as European colonizers. Another consequence was violence on a massive scale. And here our example comes from the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo was ruled directly by King Leopold II, and Leopold II was very interested in producing rubber. And so he basically tortured people of all ages, including these children shown here in this picture. And the reason why these children lack hands is because they couldn't harvest rubber fast enough. And as you look at that bottom picture, what do you imagine those two things are that man is looking at? Well, those things are his child's hand and foot. And by the look of it, I would say that child is under the age of 10. Now, upwards of 10 million people died in this situation, 3 million more than Belgium's population. Another example comes from the Philippine-American War. Filipinos wanted their independence from Spain and then from the United States. The United States didn't want to give it to them. If you thought that waterboarding was a new thing developed by the American military in 2003, well, you're wrong. Back during the Philippine-American War, American troops used what they called the water cure to try and extract information from local rebels. And of course, violence in the American West. Trail of Tears, and then the massacre of American Indians in California, where upwards of 100,000 or more Native Americans died in about 2 years. And obviously, Canada, Australia, Russia, Africa, Asia, etc. Another consequence was exploitation, and here our example comes from China, an empire that itself relied on bureaucratic abstractions and still does. They were the originators of modern bureaucracy. In the mid-1400s, China owned the greatest seagoing fleet in the world, up to 3,500 ships or so. And some of them were 5 times the size of the ships being built in Europe at that time. For instance, this picture shows a massive Chinese warship in comparison to Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria. But by 1525, all of China's treasure fleet, as it was called, was destroyed, and China was poised to circumnavigate the globe, but instead retracted into itself and focused on its land power. This was a bad move, especially since Europeans were just starting to realize the benefits of having large navies and commercial shipping industries. So pictured here are the 13 Factories neighborhood that was built along China's Pearl River. And these warehouses were the principal and sole legal site for most Western trade with China from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. And at that point, the Opium Wars sealed China's modern fate of dependency on the West. And here are some pictures of that. You see here this battle at the bottom left, and then a British sailor forcing a Chinese person to consume opium. So the Chinese realized, of course, what is going on, and one of their officials named Commissioner Lin sent a letter actually to Queen Victoria in 1839 registering his concern over this opium business. And he said, "Your honorable nation takes away the products of our central land. By what principle of reason, then, should these foreigners send in return a poisonous drug? We have heard that in your country opium is prohibited with the utmost strictness. Suppose the subjects of another country were to come to England and trade, he would certainly be required to comply with the laws of England." Reasonable enough, right? But not a reasonable proposition to the British who wanted to make lots of money off of that trade. And incidentally, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather was Warren Delano Jr., the chief operations officer of Russell and Company, whose business included the opium trade. Basically, FDR's grandpa was a drug dealer. And it wasn't just the Delanos. Harvard University was largely built on 19th century opium money. So free trade liberalism and survival of the fittest justified these policies. And we might sometimes be confused that the Chinese have a communist government and the communism is so popular in these countries where imperialism used to reign. It's not so much that they were very enamored with this individual named Karl Marx. It's that communism gave these people the Western language to oppose the capitalist-driven imperialism that they saw around them. So it's not so much they loved communism, it's that they hated empire. Another consequence is Orientalism, or in other words, the Romantic movement goes abroad. So to begin with here, where exactly is the Orient? A lot of people would say, oh, China, Korea, Japan, or maybe Malaysia and Thailand, or India. And in the 19th century, people might have said Iran and Pakistan, and the Arabian Peninsula, and Morocco. When we start to enumerate all the places the Orient is, it just becomes a huge amorphous blob. And it's a blob in our minds because it's not a place so much as a bundle of assumptions by Westerners about people across the Middle East and Asia. And it's connected to the Romantic movement because remember those Romantic writers, artists, so forth, they wanted to rebel against the Enlightenment. And so they were attracted to the idea of the Orient because it represented the Enlightenment's opposite. It represented freedom and adventure. It represented emotional and spiritual power instead of the intellect. The Orient was also supposed to be sensual and exotic, not like this Protestant Christian outlook that Europeans had. It was also supposed to be in tune with nature, right? They hadn't allowed industry and commerce to disrupt that relationship they had with the land. And Orientalism also mixes and reduces cultures and time periods. On the right, we see Mulan, this Disney-fied Chinese story. But Mulan's wearing Japanese geisha makeup. Basically, any Disney movie you watch is going to be Orientalist. On the left, we see Black Panther, and behind him is his homeland of Wakanda, which is basically an Orientalist vision of the continent of Africa. Because Wakanda was created by two white Americans, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, in the 1960s. Where is Wakanda? It's an abstract idea of an exotic place cooked up by Westerners. It's Orientalist. And of course, Orientalism justifies imperialism because, hey, Orientals are too busy having sex and doing drugs to administer themselves. No. These are just the things that Europeans indulged in when they went to Oriental places. And before kind or generous Westerners start complimenting themselves on their aid to these places, like Doctors Without Borders or World Vision or whatever, we should remember that these kind Westerners often share many of the same assumptions about progress as their imperialist colleagues. The naturalness of capitalism, for instance, or the primacy of the nuclear family. Finally here, I want to take a moment to put a spotlight on British imperialism and how those ABCs that we've been talking about played out during the Great Indian Famine of 1876 to 1878. So in India, there had been intense drought after a crop failure caused by the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and the lieutenant governor who governed India at this time was previously criticized for excessive expenditures on relief by bureaucratic authorities in London. This time around, he said, I'm not going to do that. So in 1876, he privileged abstractions over reality by following a liberal free trade policy for grain, which basically allowed that grain to be exported to foreign markets. If you can pay for it, you can have it. And if you're local and if you're Indian and you can't pay for it, well, then you can't have it. And so you ended up looking like this. The ensuing famine caused distress to a population of 58 million people, and the death toll was estimated at 5.5 million. Up there with Belgium, up there with the genocide of the Jews in World War II. And so millions died not outside the modern world system, but in the very process of being forcefully incorporated into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism. Indeed, many were murdered by the theological application of the sacred principles of Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. So this angered British citizens, right? No. These abstract deaths were acceptable in the pursuit of progress, especially in the context of racist and scientific reasoning. Besides, how else could the British get cheap clothes, food, and drugs? So instead of confronting the evils of imperialism, the British middle and upper classes retreated into the romantic abstraction of pre-imperial Britain.
The empire had led to giant industrial cities rising up all across England. They were dark, frightening places where millions of people lived in appalling conditions. What alarmed those in charge was the violence and the anger that was building up there among what was called the masses. But the danger also seemed to come from the top of society as well. From the new industrialists and bankers who ran the global empire. They also seemed to be out of control. There was a wave of financial scandals, and no one seemed to be able to stop them. The novelist E.M. Forster wrote, "England is being menaced by the inner darkness in high places that has come with this commercial age." Trapped by what they saw as a danger below and corruption above, the middle classes retreated. They turned away into another imaginary version of England, where there were none of these threats. It was invented for them by a whole generation of writers, artists, and musicians, who in an act of collective imagination created a complete dream image of England's past, one that still haunts the country today. At its heart was a vision of a natural order in the countryside outside the cities. One of the key figures was a man called Cecil Sharp. He travelled through England recording old songs, and he filmed himself and his friends learning old rural dances. Sharp made it absolutely clear that this was a political project. His aim was to create a new kind of English nationalism, which had at its heart the idea of the folk. It was a concept that he had taken from German nationalism, the innocent rural people and their culture.
And so we can see how this then feeds into a broader European movement to try and restore this lost past that they felt they had had. And the Nazis really seize on that after the First World War and exploit it. And then not only did these European middle classes retreat into themselves and away from the world, they imposed those same romantic and abstract delusions they had back on their colonies via Orientalism. And to explain that is another video excerpt.
After the First World War, a group of upper-class English men and women were sent to Baghdad to create a new country out of the ruins of what had been the Ottoman Empire. The most famous was Gertrude Bell. She was the daughter of a baronet and had been a famous explorer. Almost immediately, hundreds of thousands of Arabs rose up, demanding independence. The British had been financially broken by the war, so they invented a new and cheap way of suppressing the insurgency. They used aircraft to bomb the rebels. They called it aerial policing, and they took back control and set about creating the new country, called Iraq. But because there was no money, the group could also not afford to survey the country. Instead, with no information, Bell and the others simply projected onto the Arabs that powerful romantic dream of an old England. They decided that the middle classes in the cities who had run the country under the Ottoman Empire were corrupt and untrustworthy, which meant that they had to be excluded from power. Instead, power should be given to the sheikhs, who ruled the tribes out in the countryside. To the British, the sheikhs represented the true Iraq, because they hadn't been infected by the corruption of the modern world. Their system was one of a natural order, just like in the England of the past. The sheikhs, said Gertrude Bell, are like great aristocrats. They will run a system that will maintain a natural equilibrium. The truth was that this picture of Iraq was completely detached from reality. The sheikhs were really marginal figures, while the Ottomans had begun to create a modern, progressive society in the cities. The British now tore that apart and replaced it with a strange dream that had nothing to do with the complex, multi-layered society in front of their eyes, but was really rooted in the strange, dark fears that were rising up in Britain itself as its power declined. Then, in 1932, the British, facing an economic crisis at home, packed up and went, leaving behind them a completely unreal and unstable society.
So it's little wonder why the West continues to misunderstand what is going on in the Middle East, or how they've caused a lot of these issues. So as we can see, quite painfully here, reality never matches abstraction. Basically, Westerners wanted to live in the comfort of an imagined pre-modern past, enjoy the wonders of the real modern present, while demanding a future that is both comforting and wondrous via progress. Basically, they wanted it all. In conclusion, then they were gone. This is a graph that shows the total area of the British Empire, and after World War II, we see that dramatically diminish. This is called decolonization, and it was an invention. It had to be. European countries could no longer maintain their vast empires after World War II, so they had to invent a concept that made it seem natural and normal. Aha, yes, we might be out of money, but this was always supposed to happen anyways. But did they really ever leave? Here we see a picture of French troops disembarking in northern Africa. In most places around the world, former imperializers are still in these imperialized places, controlling them or manipulating them. And although there is debate over the lingering effects of imperialism, we're now going on 70, 80 years, it is a fact that it changed Westerners' relationship with the world via an increase in Western territorial, military, financial, and cultural power, an unprecedented incursion of Westerners into the lives of non-Westerners, and basically, Westerners forcefully inserted themselves into hundreds of delicate socio-political situations around the world and then abruptly left. You can imagine how long this will take to resolve. Remember the Industrial Revolution's vast, uncontrolled, and unscientific experiment? Well, basically the idea was let's make it global. So what happens when we rename an entire society? What happens when we give everyone opium? What happens when we let the free market decide who gets food? What happens when we remotely manage hundreds of unique societies? What happens when we cut up a continent based on a map in Berlin? Well, I don't know. Let's find out. We're now at the end of the lecture. I'll leave the theses up here on the screen. Thanks once again for listening to this lecture series, and don't forget to subscribe and click like.